I will start with the box model, and then we're gonna go forward to some basic display properties, move on to positioning, how things behave a little bit in the DOM, how things can get hairy when you're not expecting, which I think is the most interesting part of what I'm trying to bring here, because sometimes we're moving things around and we are sure that we're adding widths to something and heights to the thing, margin here and there, and it doesn't seem to work. And I understand the frustration of being there. Before I started working as a full-fledged developer, I worked with CSS for maybe 10 years. And this was a time where we didn't have Flexbox or anything. We used floats for accomplishing some sort of layout. So that was tough. And today is much better. And I hope you are excited about it, just as I am. So, like I said, our goal today is to reduce your frustration towards CSS. CSS can be very demanding sometimes. You will probably have a few days where you cannot figure out why something is not working the way it should. And ideally, what we try to do in these situations is take a step back, go element by element. Sometimes, just go up in the tree, try deleting them from the DOM. And after we delete these elements from the DOM, we try to figure out if the problem is still there. There's many ways to debug it and try to pinpoint where the problem is. Sometimes that's a good way to do it. So let's think about also what I'm not going to talk about here. So this is not a very extremely detailed course on what you should do or what things happens. And this is not something that you must know. If you leave this meeting with knowing one more thing, like if you get 1% of what I'm talking about, I'm very happy. These things are difficult. And this is definitely not a guideline to how things should be agreed. This is just my thoughts. And I'm bringing this without thinking, oh, our product should be like this. I have no idea how our product should be. This is not my job. This is the clinician core team. They decide everything. They are really good at that. And I leave that to them. I trust them completely on that. Okay, so how this will work. I will try to go to the material that I wrote for an hour. I think it's plenty of time. I will provide these CodePen links so you can follow along. And I will open them and try a few things out. And then I'll try to leave the last 30 minutes for you to have questions. And if there's no questions, we can just end earlier, right? And yeah, I'm recording. So if you cannot attend, if you need to leave, it's okay. You can just watch it later. It's fine. Or don't. So let's start with the box model. And okay, I'm going to first provide this CodePen link to you. I'm going to post here in the meeting, but you're going to have access to this afterwards as well. And it's just if you want to follow along. So I'm going to open here. And when we talk about the box model, one thing that is important to remember in the DOM or when you are open your HTML, every time that you add one element, every single element that you add to the page is going to be a rectangle of some sort. Okay, so you can, of course, you can add some clipping here, clip path, there are properties that you can make to make things look like shapes, but at the end of the day, they are boxes underneath everything. And this is how a box usually is. So inside of the main constraints of it, you have the content. So the content is usually what you're written there. So a text, an image, something, it's going to be the content. So around the content is the padding. Around the padding, there's a border. So a good thing to remember, for example, if you're creating links like I have here, beneath, the content is clickable, the padding is clickable, interactive, the border is as well, but the margin isn't. So if, for example, you're adding a space between elements and you don't want the user to interact between them, let's say a button towards something else, you can use a margin instead. Although if you use a padding, sometimes, there's no background color, so you would appear like it is the same thing, but it isn't. And it's interesting how it isn't. So if you look at these links beneath here, let me just add a small border to them, right? Perhaps you can even see this border. Okay, it's loading. And I'm going to add to them a padding of 10 pixels, right? So you can see there's a small border. Let's increase this border a little bit. And we can already see that something weird is going on, right? So what's going on here? These links here, I'm putting them, they're getting on top of everything. Like, why are they doing that? All right. So the thing is that these links here, as you can see, there's an image, there's a header here with these links, right? And pretty much these links are just links one side of the other. And this is a behavior that you see often, and you're like, why is this bug happening, right? So this bug is happening because links are phrasing content, and they don't have a box around them, just like other types of content that have this box to create this spacing around them. So when we add widths and heights and stuff like that to create spacing for elements that are phrasing content, so they are inline elements, they just don't work. They work, but they create these behaviors, right? So if I come here and add height, you see nothing happens. If I add width, nothing happens. Nothing is going to happen to these elements because width and height is not a property that is acceptable to inline elements. So if I transform this element into a block element, then everything falls into place. Now you see, as soon as I add a block element to them, what happens? They went each one of them in a different line, right? Perhaps you don't want that. You still want to have that behavior where they are side by side, but they are not on top of each other. How do you do that? Well, we also have one other display property that is called Inline-Block. So what Inline-Block does is try to wrap the element inside of a block, but it kind of respects the properties of a block element while still keeping the inline flow. So these will behave like a text, but at the same time, they have all properties accepted by a block. Should you create all your elements in Inline-Block? No, you should not. You definitely want the behavior of one or the other in other places, right? But this is a good thing to already keep in mind. Like, wow, this whole thing was stopping me from work. Let's say if I block this again, you know, I have this weird behavior, and it's just like displaying Inline-Block. And sometimes it's so hard to see these things. But as soon as you start getting used to it, start thinking a little bit more CSS, you're like, okay, this is easy. I know how to do this. I know what's going on. Usually what you do is you look through the HTML. You see that these elements are here. Their parent is a div, and they are inside of the div, but you know, there's not much else space for them to go. And yeah, they need space. They need a block element wrapping them. That's why sometimes we put links in paragraphs or inside of, we create buttons instead. I think buttons are also inline elements. We check that later. Let's see. If you go to the next one, let's go a little bit more in a documentation level here. So how are these elements divided? And just like we saw, these elements, they're inline elements like a link, they are phrasing content, right? So phrasing line elements are going to be a span, a button, an image, the links, there's many others. I can send this link to you. Also, again, they'll be available afterwards, so you don't have to worry about copying and pasting this here, just if you're curious now. And block elements, the heading elements, the div, the paragraphs, the sections, you know, these will be block elements. And with these block elements, there you have block element behaviors, and inline elements will have inline element behaviors. And when you add in CSS to these elements, you have to keep in mind what kind of element am I adding CSS to. Not all properties will behave the same. Not all properties work the same. They are different, right? And we are adding more elements to the DOM nowadays. There are many new elements coming by. And if we don't keep this in mind, we can maybe not understand what's going on. So if you move forward here, like I'm talking elements, flow, phrasing, interaction, like what the hell is even that, right? You see this flow here, like, okay, already, I see a Venn diagram, this seems good, but what is this, right? So let's try a few hands-on things here, right? So let's try moving a few positionings in the elements. So I'm gonna advance some content to you. So we have these basic positions available. So static is the default one. Every time you add an element to the page, by default, it is going to be static. If you don't change anything, it's always static. You can add it to be position relative or position sticky. You probably saw these already. And there is position absolute and fixed. So the difference between them are major, and they all have a different functionality. So let's look at this one. Let me share this with you as well. So let's take a look at this one. So we have this page here, and let's say our designer says, hey, I want this image here to have a bit more spacing here. I want to move this image a little bit to the left. And you're right, okay, I can do that. It's just perhaps adding a margin, right? Let's see where we are with these ones. So if I'm getting my image here, so it's this one probably. I'm going to say, hey, a little bit to the left, 100 pixels to the left, 100 pixels to the top. You go on and you do it. What happens? Nothing happens. Nothing happens to your image, and you're there wondering why that nothing happens. It's because the content that this image is on, not the content that this image is, the parent content of this image is position static. So when you say left, it's left of what? The image doesn't have anything to work on, right? So we can change the position of the image to be static is the default. I'm go through this one. But if the image is position relative, then the relative position of this section here of this image, it is going to attach to this left and right. And if this means in position relative, like I mentioned here before, position relative are still in the flow. But in the flow, what it means, you see this space around here. So this space still exists because virtually this image is still there. When we move these things left and right, or with transitions and things like this, and the positioning is relative, these spaces are still going to be kept, which is great. Most often than not, if you're doing animations, for example, you want to keep the space there. You don't want things to be moving around too much while you are also animating something. Otherwise, it gets messy. But there are other ways. So perhaps you don't want this space to be there. So what do? Well, you have position absolute for that. But what happened here? Position absolute works a little bit differently. So the position absolute needs to have a parent that has relative positioning. So the body of the page will be the first relative position that this image can attach to. So this image is here on top now, if you haven't seen that well yet. And how will I make this image to be on top of the text, if that's what I want? Well, then I need to go into the section that this text is, I believe is this one, and I need to make this section a position relative. So now my closest parent that has a position relative is the one where I'm going to have this left and top related to, right? So in position absolute, when you move things around on a page, they kind of move along because, it's relative to this area here, right? It's probably here where my section starts. So this image is going to be attached here, right? So if instead I set this image to be position fixed, and, well, you guessed, position fixed is going to be fixed in this string at this position no matter what. And it is not to the section. Fixed is fixed to the viewport, as far as I know. I think it's a viewport. And what will happen is that it will be 100 to the left, 100 to the top, and it's always going to stay here. And perhaps that's not what we want. And sometimes what we actually want is some form of, let's say, this heading here. We actually want to make this heading go down with the text, right? It's a long text, and we perhaps don't remember what we are reading when we're down there. So, let's keep the text there. And let's see. Well, to keep the text there, you heard, let's do position sticky, right? If we put this one in position sticky, let's do something like this. Position sticky, and it should work, right? No, it doesn't work. Why it doesn't work? Well, it's first same reason as before. Position sticky, just like position absolute, you need something to relate to. If you don't have this relation, then you can't attach anything to anything, right? Okay, so this one you learn. You go in position relative, and now it's going to work. Well, not yet. Why? Because you just said, I want this to be position sticky, but you didn't say, okay, what do I stick it to? So you also need to give that. Usually what we do is like top 0, and then yeah, stick to the top. That's nice. But what if we go and say left? And then why didn't this go to the left? Well, what's happening here, right? So what is happening here is that H2 is a block element. And like all block elements, it is going to occupy the whole space of the page. And unless this page would scroll to the left, this would never attach to the left in the same sense. So if I give it some space, let's say like this, and start scrolling to the left, oh, it didn't go. Oh, how do we do this? Well, like I said, the position here, and well, this is going to be frustrating. So if I go back here, perhaps what I can do is to give background red. And you see, it still goes to the end because it's position, it's display block by default, the headings. So if you change this to inline block, like we saw before, now the width is not full width anymore. And when you go left, see, there it goes. So there's a lot of thoughts of these things. You have to keep everything together. You can't just try to drop some properties in like willy-nilly. They're not just going to work. You need to analyze where you are. You need to analyze what is the parent. Usually the direct parent is the most important one, and so on and so forth. And then what properties am I adding? What do they need? Each property might need something different, and it is important for us to keep those in mind, right? And I think you are getting an understanding of how this works, right? So here, nice, I have this other heading here, and it stops at the end because my section ended here, and then another one starts, and that's a behavior that we want for our blog. That's nice. Okay, so if we move next, and we talk a little bit about these. We talk about sticky, absolute, fixed. I think this it's a good amount. So let's talk about the viewport, and let's start with the key takeaways for the viewport. I'm going to paste the links for you if you want to take a look at this. Don't think before I open. So some key takeaways. Viewport is tricky, right? So viewport is the window available in the device that you open that browser or the application. So that window could have a few differences. Applications for iPhones. The viewport is not reliable because these things, when you add 100 viewport here or there, you are taking all the space that exists, but that space could be bigger than you actually want it to be. I show an example. And also a good thing to think. Oof, I can't speak anymore. A good thing to have in mind is to not use viewports with large fixed width elements. They will often break and overflow on the page, especially when you go smaller. And don't let content rely on a viewport to be nice, because you know that viewport is sometimes not what we do. Even in apps nowadays, have them side by side and shrink here, stretch there, zooming. It's not going to work the same. And I'm going to give you one basic example on this one. So if we open this one, we have here the viewport. This one is a border exactly at the viewport here, this purplish border here. And I see if my viewport reaches like 600 pixels here, the background turns green, right? And this image here is exactly 600 pixels as well. If you don't trust me, you can look at the code. But what happens here now is that, okay, this seems perfect. Why are you telling me that I shouldn't use viewports for calculating this? Well, we use, in general, I think most of us at least, use MacBooks for developments. And by default, a MacBook does not have a sidebar. Well, when you scroll, you see the sidebar, but the sidebar appears on top of the page. If you are on a Windows computer, most Linux distros, or if you set this setting here, so this is a general setting for the Mac, And if you go here, show scroll bars, and you click always, what you have in here. Okay, this is fun. So sidebar says here, here's my viewport, but what is happening here? So the sidebars and these extra elements like the notch, things like this, they are not accounted by the viewport. You always break your content. So when you go to web page and we go back and forth just a little bit, you know what it is. Somebody messed up the CSS. You should not have used 100 VW width, right? So these things are important to keep in mind. Viewports are not that reliable. They were useful, but nowadays have much better stuff to work with. So what would you do? Well, we have calculations in CSS, and we have a few functions that calculate. So the calc function, you just pass an operation, and anything that you put inside, like multiplications, divisions, additions, anything, it will calculate to you. And you can put multiple different values. Like you see in the example down here, if you put a VW and 20 RAM and pixels and EMs and things like this, they will match up together. CSS is really good at understanding what the size will be and calculate underneath, and it does that really fast. And you also have the mean attribute. The mean attribute is going to take the minimum value. So let's say, for example, you set 70% or 500 pixels. Well, if 70% of the screen is smaller than 500 pixels, I will pick the 70%. If my screen is, I don't know, 1920, which is the default one, I think, then 500 pixels is going to be smaller than 70% in that case. And the same thing you can say for the max. They're just like the inverse, right? But you also have a clamp. Clamp is fun because clamp, what it does, it picks a range of values. Let's say I want this div to be 350 pixels, but I also want it to be a maximum of, I don't know, 500 and a minimum of 200. And you can calculate these things in between and give these different values, even with min max function. You can match all them together, right? But you know, it starts to get confusing again, right? Yeah, I know, I understand. Yeah, when I start thinking about talking about things that are like not very, you can touch them very much and having used very much, it gets complex. So let me share this link with you as well, and we go through this example. Right. So if I go to this one, in this one I have function, and this div here is going to be 500 pixels, which is the maximum size. But I chose the size where I'm comfortable with. I want it to be 50% of the page, right? But if my page shrinks to such a degree where 50% is too big, maybe I want it to decrease until it reaches a minimum of 250. Right. So what happens? So this div is such decreasing. Oh, we're here. Now we're not on 500 anymore. We are on 50%, right? And you can see here I have the parent window width is 960 here. So if I keep reducing, this is gonna get smaller and smaller and smaller until we reach 350. And then it gets to this size. And this is great to create fluid layouts. So if you have, for example, a card where you have a picture of somebody and some description on the right and some things underneath, they work well within certain sizes, but you don't want them to become too small or too big, right? So clamp is a great function. In one line, you can set all these. You can have a lot of CSS that also does the same, but with one line, you can do all this, and it's fluid, it's beautiful, and it is really easy to get used to it as soon as you start working with it. Okay, but I understand you have many units. I'm gonna make a recommendation to you. If you're not super familiar with them, mainly use pixels, you're fine. You don't really need many other units. EMs and REMs were really good a while ago because they were able to zoom in and zoom out in the browsers, and pixels weren't zooming in at the same pace. So a lot of people changed them to never use pixels again, but now they fixed the browser. So now if you zoom in, the text also zooms in the same way. So it's just complicated, right? And a lot of people set EMs to be 10 pixels, so you don't have to calculate many things. Just use pixels, it's easier. You also have CH, which is an interesting one. So let's say we know that readability-wise, if we have up to 65 characters, I think, or something like that, between 58 or something, you have the better readability of the text. So if you use CH, you can set the width of something to be of 65 CH, and then we'll fit 65 characters inside of it. If you have text like blogs and things like this could increase the readability, increase the amount of people reading this stuff because it's easier to read. And we saw, we saw Viewport, and Viewport also has the vmin and vmax. What they do is they pick the smallest unit. So instead of you setting, I want this to be the viewport width or the viewport height, you set the vmin or the vmax. So you want the longest value of the viewport. If it's a phone, for example, it's a good example. If it's a phone, you don't know if the phone's going to be landscape or not. And if it is, you don't want to have media queries dealing with all that. So you could use vmin and vmax to deal with those values, and then it calculates for you, right? But calculating stuff is super complex, and percentages are relative to the parents, and pixels can get on top of pixels. Then you have to add multiple media queries in between, and it is getting frustrating, isn't it? How do you create good, fluid design nowadays? Yeah, most of these things, luckily, they were kind of old, and they exist since the 97, if I'm not mistaken. But since 2005 or 2008, we have launched CSS3. That's nice. And CSS3 introduced a bunch of new things. CSS3 is still releasing a bunch of things. Now we are on the scope of CSS4. It hasn't released many things yet. It has some selectors, some things that I can show you later on in the course. We have like a fourth day. But mainly, these are amazing. These are most of the stuff that we're going to use, that we are using today. And today, I want to try to talk a little bit about Flexbox and how Flexbox works. I'm not that good at Flexbox, I'm going to admit. I usually seek out what the things that I do, but I'm going to try to bring all my knowledge to you in this one. Sometimes I forget a few properties. There are many of them. But you do here and there, most important, you learn what are the questions that you need to ask. Then it's easy to find an answer. It's super easy to find an answer if you know what to ask. And Flexbox is that kind of stuff. Like sometimes you just do display flex and things just magically works. Like this is exactly what I wanted, and you just leave it at that. But sometimes it doesn't do what you really wanted to, and you try adding a grow here, a shrink there, align content, and you don't know if it's align, if it's justify, or if it's content of items or self, and you mix all those properties, and you're kind of lost, right? So I will try to help you a little bit in this one. And I'm not going to talk extensive about this. I have a link to a course later on if you're very interested in this. It's where I learned. It is free. Don't worry about that. I'm sure company covers all these things. They're very good at that. But this one is free. And we're going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals and most importantly, how to think when using Flexbox, right? So Flexbox, let's give a navigation example. I think everyone created a navigation to a website once using Flexbox. So I'm going to paste a link here. And a few things to keep in mind is once you add a display flex to an element, a lot of things are going to happen underneath. So the block, the children in that block, they kind of lose their display properties. They're not display block, inline anymore. They are flex items, right? Even if you add them, if you forcibly add important display block, it is not going to work. They are going to be flex items. That is defined. And this is a quote from a guy that is known as the CSS King on the YouTube. If you search for CSS King, you'll find this guy. Flex item wants to be as small as it can possibly get while maintaining everything in one line. And if you keep this in your mind while working with CSS, it's going to get much easier. you're going to see that we're going to go through this multiple times, and it's going to make sense, right? So let's go to the first example. I don't think it's this one, I think it's this one instead. So here we have, let's say I started navigation. It's not navigation yet. So let's make this a navigation, right? So here I have already my nav list, which is this element here. I just added this border here, so it's easy for us to see what's going on. Maybe I can add a body. I can add a heading here. Adding 20 bits. So it's a little bit more separated from the body, right? Also, all lists by default comes with these. So what we can do is say list style known, and they will disappear. And so if we add display flex to this one, and we want to make a menu, sometimes, no, perhaps that's exactly what we need. Of course, not without this, not with these borders here. This, again, are just for you to see what is actually going on in these spaces, which is actually important right now. So we have an interesting property here that we can use. They're two tied up together, right? So what you can do is you go and say, hey, for each item here, I want to have like a margin left of 10 pixels, but then then the first ones like this, they need to be like alive first child, remove this one, or last child. You don't want to do that. We have a property nowadays called a gap. We can just use gap, and gap will calculate this distance for you, and it calculates in both axes, so x and y axis, if things are stacking. And now a few interesting properties. So we have this menu here. So what is happening, right? So when we add a display flex, let's go back just a second. But a display flex, this thing was like this, but now everything is in one row, and everything is side by side. What is happening, right? And how is it that Flexbox is defining these sizes here? Remember how this is much smaller than these ones, right? So how is Flexbox calculating these? Well, Flexbox calculate this just like also more recent property that exists within CSS is it's like adding a width of max content. And what max content will do is you try to fit everything in one line without line breaks, and you give the content enough space for it to fit without breaking lines. And it tries to keep everything in one line, just like Flex does. And if you wonder, yeah, we also have a main content. And what that will do is that will break lines. And the biggest one will be the word or the image, whatever is inside, that occupies the most space. So that will dictate the space of this one, right? But we don't need this. So now that is how it's working when you do display flex also, and that's how it's calculating this. So then we're like, hey, I actually want these items to be more spaced around, right? Let's add them, let's add space between them. Let's work like that. So you add this, and it's beautiful. You have everything separated here, but you realize the spaces here are very even, right? So that is exactly what you want sometimes, but sometimes that is not exactly what the designer wants. It's like, hey, no, I just don't want them to be aligned at the beginning, which is by default is like start. And that's not what they want. They wanted it to be aligned to the end. And yeah, you can do that. And oh, right, that's good. But also, what happens if we start growing our space? Because perhaps not very useful here, but we have properties by default. We have flex shrink 1, which is what gives Flexbox its magic, right? If we set flex shrink to 0, what will happen is that it's not Flexbox. The content should have reloaded. Okay. Am I working here? Okay, this possibly is not working, or is it in the wrong place? No, it's not debugging things like this. I'm not sure why this is not working here. Perhaps I'm setting again afterwards. No, I'm not. But flex shrink by default, when you go in the net, say, hey, how would I make everything grow? You do flex. You say, yeah, just do flex 1, right? That's what people recommend you to do. And you have all content being spread around like this. So what is happening here is that you have flex shrink set to 1, and 0 should not work. I will try to debug this afterwards if I come up with an answer to this. Perhaps it's just me not seeing something. Flex grow is the other magic. So when you have flex grow set to 1, it applies all the space available, right? So now that flex end that we have here is not useful anymore because you don't have enough available space for you to have it aligned to the end or to the start or whatever else. So also that's another thing that you have to keep in mind. Sometimes if we don't have these lines, it's easy to see because we have these lines around this borders telling us. But when we're just trying to fit content and they're just not doing what we want to do, more often than not, we don't have space to do what we're trying to do. And usually it's because I have our flex grow set to 1. Now, when you see this, you see that these elements grew, but they are not the same size. Okay, I think I have perhaps a better example of this. So let's try moving forward here to like another type of navigation. So we saw the max content. It's similar to how things work. We can try creating a wrap here. Let's see. I think that's an interesting one. So if enable flex wrap here for us. So, well, nothing happens because everything fits, right? So for the content to wrap, it needs to be small enough that the extra space, see that the extra space is disappearing here. So as soon as there's no extra space anymore, it breaks to the next line. And then you'll be like, hey, but I don't want this to be this big. I want them to be separated around. How do I do that? We're going to see a little bit more of that later on, but then it has to do with the third one of these properties, which is flex basis, right? But not look at much more in this example. We've been here for a while now. But important to think about is that each row will act independently from the other rows, right? Like we see here, this row here, completely independent from this one. They will have their own properties, not their own properties, but they will have their own flow, kind of. That's how they work and calculate the stuff in their own rows. So if you think a bit more about this alignment and justification that we just saw, let's go through another example. I send it to you. And okay, so important things to keep in mind. You must have room to apply. We saw this one already. If we don't have room, it doesn't make sense to try to align top, bottom, middle, center. It just doesn't have anywhere to go. What's going to align, right? So you need space, first of all. And second, the flex direction changes the container axis. So when we do flex direction column, the default is row, I think. Well, it's either one or the other. So if you don't remember, sometimes I don't remember, you just try the other one. And flex direction changes the container axis. So I think it's better to show an example. But if things justify horizontally when they are in a row, they will justify vertically when they are in columns. Why? Because it changes the axis as well. And if you do row reverse, column reverse as well, it also inverts that. We're going to see that later on. So in the specification of CSS, they added terms justifying a line to distinguish between these alignments. So you can read more here in the specification. But let's go through some of the examples here. I think it's these ones. So in this one here, where do I start? I think it's around here. So in this one here, we have these columns. So we have some columns here. Each column have, in this column, I have 3 cards, and that's it. That's mainly what I have. There's nothing much happening here. So let's start with the basics. Let's do a display flex. and hope for the best. Hey, this is not what I want. Let me add a gap between them. So you kind of want the cards to be the same size, right? You don't want them to be bigger than the other. But what is happening here? It is similarly to what we saw before with max content. In this one, if we do a flex shrink to this one, flex shrink 0, okay, and this one works. You know, sometimes you need to bug a little bit further. But what flex shrink does is it removes the Flexbox magic, like I mentioned before. So now everything is in one line. And can you see that this one is much bigger than the other two? I don't delete this sign. I hate when I do that. Don't understand why Mac does that sometimes. But you know, these ones are much smaller than this last one. So if I turn back in my flex shrink back to 1, what is happening here is that they are growing within the size that is available to them. And if I set my flex grow to 1, this is a shorthand for all this, right? So they already occupy all the space available, so it doesn't really matter, right? Flex grow is not doing much here. But what flex 1 does, it's also set the flex basis to 0. By default is auto. So when we do that, we are basically saying, hey, I don't want to set a default size to this thing. A way to think about flex basis is similar to how you think about widths. You can go here and set this one to 200 pixels, for example, and they should become 200 pixels. Is it reloading again, or is it my page too small? I don't know. I think something is not reloading properly. But a good way to think about flex basis is they should follow the same idea, not exactly the same, but it's very similar to how you think about widths. But if you have widths defined, flex basis will look at what the width is doing to then apply flex basis on top of it if it can. So it is a little bit more complex. It's the type of stuff that I'm not going to go through here right now because there's a lot of math involved. But if you're interested, like I said, there's going to be a course later on. They're going to talk about it. And yeah, sometimes we also set flex basis to 100%. But if we don't have a flex shrink set or flex grow set, then the flex basis will, and basically they're set to this, right? So you need to have these ones. So what we've set that it's 100% widths now. So they will follow the 100% width of the content, it's like 100%. So here, if I believe here, if I set this one to 200 pixels, that will work, right? Yeah, so that's it. Perhaps I forgot to set my flex shrink to 0. If my flex shrink is 1, nothing happens because it's supposed to shrink, right? My flex grow was 1, and that's why it was growing. So how can we move things around? Okay, we learn a little bit about how we can manage them to be of the same size and everything. Let's see what else we have here. I don't really remember. So these are some alignment and justification, right? But how these align items and align content could work in what we're trying to do. And most of the time, at least from what I've been working with, most of the time I use align items, although I do try align contents as well when I'm trying, because it's just switching one to the other to see what the behavior happens. It is really hard to keep those two in mind. They almost do the same thing, but they are a little bit different. I'm going to show you an example here. I'll send you this one as well. And move next here to these ones. So in this one, I have one. Let's go through what is it, right? So here I have just a few divs inside of align items, and the same thing I have inside of align contents, a little bit more in the other one. And here in the middle, I have an item large. And this item large, what I'm doing is I'm just changing the aspect ratio, which is also sort of a new property. So I want this aspect ratio to be 1:2. It's like 16:9 on your screen. That's how you can define these things. And so in my align items, I'm aligning items to start. I'm wrapping the content in align content, and I'm setting the min height to 80 VH, which is the viewport height. And that is the behavior that it has here. So nice. And this one, as you can see here, this one doesn't grow as much as these other two because it has to keep that aspect ratio that we defined, right? So if I go into this first one, let's see align self, and I do align self end. What will happen here? Okay, no, this I'm selecting just one side. This is a spoiler alert. If I change here to end, what will happen here is that all of them are going to follow and go to the end, right? And the center, same thing. If you know how to write center. And it's always the center thing nowadays, right? Before it was much harder than this. We had to use padding hacks and everything. But now, if you go through align content, we have justify content center. What is happening? Align content end, then everything goes to the end. You see, it's not quite the same behavior that we have here. Right? It is. These are small differences. Well, in this case, it's a big difference. I picked a cherry picked an example where the difference would. In most cases, it's almost the same thing. But look how different they act because of this, right? So they have. I think I disconnected. Who doesn't have internet problems when we are giving a presentation, right? Sorry about that. Well, like I was saying, more often than not, you will use align items. But in general, try them. They have a few key different behaviors. I don't want to go through all the minuscule differences that they have, but I have here a link to you. This is the specification of the W3. They go extends towards this. It's a proper documentation to these things. But we also have align self. And what align self does is it completely ignores what everyone tells it to do. It doesn't follow its siblings. It does its own thing, So if we select an element here, like we did before, a little bit of spoiler, say here I'm selecting the second child here, and I say, hey, if this is going to be align self end, then this one does its own thing without affecting the others. And this is really interesting. Sometimes you do want that behavior. Sometimes you want things to move along on a page, and you want other things to be aligning in a certain way, right? Sometimes you want all the others to be aligned to the start. Did start? Yeah. Yeah. So usually that is a unwanted behavior. Sometimes you can control things like this, and it's really interesting that you have these possibilities to you. So you have more things to think in mind. So you have your axis that you have to think in mind. So if the axis changes and you still want to change them from top bottom, then you're going to use justify instead of align. And if you were working with inverse axis, let's create an example of this. I think we can use this one. So in this align example here, let's say flex direction column. What happens here? It's interesting to try these behaviors. If that's how you write column, sometimes I forget. In the editor, they correct for me, and I keep forgetting. So is it the default column maybe? Or is it not updating? Am I offline again? I don't know. No, well, that's what I have for trying to code online while in a meeting. What was that? Is it? Where did I have an example? I'm not gonna waste your time with this. But flex direction, you just change the axis, right? So how that axis changes. So a row. Oh yeah. Yeah. What? I would. Yeah, I'm not sure. Perhaps I changed something else that I shouldn't. So in the default one is flex direction row, and then you have your x-axis being on the left and goes to the right. Row reverse, it goes from right to left. If you display a column, your x is going to be from top down, and reverse down top, or down up would be better. But these are just things to keep in mind. You probably will apply them and try to think about. But the good thing for you to keep in mind is that if you need to revert something, revert some order of a list, sometimes you don't need to go directly into JavaScript all the time and say, hey, I want to resort this list and programmatically go through that big O n times 2 notation that, you know, it's going to consume a little bit more resources. CSS does that much faster because it's just moving things around. It doesn't have to think about the data itself, plus not mutating a data that you're getting from somewhere. So, you know, sometimes you can apply these things as an alternative. I think this is a copy of the other one that I forgot to erase. So, okay, this was, maybe if I go here, yeah, I'm not sure, something is missing here, but yeah, something is missing in my presentation. This was not supposed to be here, but if you want to learn more about Flexbox, there's here's a website where I learned. So it's a free course. You just put your email, you join the course, and they will send messages to pay for the other course, but this one itself is free. And it is still very valid to this day, although a few things are updated. So I hope this was a little bit enlightening and you learned something from this. I'm sorry I'm not on my best, but I hope I could have helped you today. Does anyone have any questions that I can try to answer? Perhaps not. No, you can be free to send me a message afterwards. It's fine. I much like to help you out. So just send me a message in Slack or whatever. And if you have something, let me know. And we can try to figure things out together. Right? Cheers.